Night fell heavy over the Pacific. The humid air carried the sound of insects and whispers of men gripping their rifles too tense to blink. Suddenly, it began. A roar, primal, furious, erupted from the jungle. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers, bayonets glinting under moonlight, stormed forward in a desperate, frenzied rush. They screamed, "Tenno Haika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" For the Marines dug in at Saipan, it was the most terrifying sound imaginable. A human wave of death was racing toward them. But then, the earth itself answered. American artillery batteries opened fire, unleashing a storm of steel and flame. The night turned into hell. Shells exploded in rippling arcs, ripping through the charging masses. Bodies fell by the hundreds. Yet still they came, and still the guns thundered. By dawn, thousands of Japanese lay dead. The largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War had been obliterated in a single night, broken not by sheer bravery or numbers, but by the cold precision of American artillery coordination. But this was not a single night, nor a single battle. This was a grim pattern of the Pacific War, where Japan's 6 suicidal Banzai charges met America 6's mastery of firepower, and behind this clash lay questions of honor, desperation, and the human cost of war. To understand why thousands of men rushed headlong into certain death, and why America 6's artillery became the ultimate equalizer, we must step back. We must understand the code of Bushido, the desperation of Japan's 6's Pacific strategy, and the soldiers who faced the unimaginable. This is the story of how America 6's artillery shattered Japan 6's last desperate hope, and why echoes of those charges still haunt the memory of World War II. To understand the violence of the Pacific, we must first understand the mindset behind the Banzai charge. For Japan, the Second World War was not just a clash of armies, it was a clash of ideologies, honor and survival. The Japanese Imperial Army was bound by an ancient warrior ethos, Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was a code shaped by centuries of samurai tradition, teaching loyalty unto death, the rejection of surrender, and the belief that sacrifice for the emperor was the highest honor. By 1944, as Japan's 6's empire stretched across the Pacific, its soldiers carried this code into modern war, but the battlefield they faced was unlike anything their ancestors had ever known. In the early years of the war, Japanese troops stunned the world with lightning victories, conquering Malaya, the Philippines, and sweeping across the Pacific. But as the tide turned at Midway and Guadalcanal, Japan began to lose ground, their supplies dwindled, their navy, once dominant, faltered, and their air power thinned against the relentless strength of American industry. For Japan's 6 soldiers, defeat was unthinkable. Surrender was dishonor. Instead, commanders turned to the tactic of Banzai charges, mass infantry assaults, often at night, meant to break enemy lines through sheer shock and sacrifice. The word Banzai itself means 10,000 years, a cry of loyalty to the emperor, shouted as men hurled themselves at entrenched American positions. But what had once been a bold tactic in earlier wars, like against Russia in 1905, proved disastrous against the modern firepower of World War II. The US Marines and Army had something the samurai never faced: coordinated artillery. Forward observers, crouched with binoculars on ridgelines, called fire missions with pinpoint accuracy. Radios crackled. Batteries of 105 mm howitzers and 155 mm long-toms thundered in response. Entire jungle hillsides vanished in eruptions of dirt and fire. Against this storm, no human wave could prevail. Yet still, they charged. Many of these men carried not only rifles, but also family photos tucked inside their tunics. Some left behind final letters, never to be delivered. They were sons, brothers, fathers, and though their cause was imperial ambition, their deaths were deeply human. For the Americans who faced them, the horror was unforgettable. Marines spoke of the ground littered with bodies after a Banzai charge, thousands of men cut down in hours, their courage wasted against cold steel and fire. This was the tragic meeting of two worlds, a warrior code rooted in feudal honor, colliding with the mechanized destruction of modern war. The result was slaughter on an unimaginable scale. But how did it feel to face one of these charges? To hear the night explode with screams and gunfire, To call down the wrath of artillery upon human waves rushing forward? To answer that, we must step into the boots of the men who endured it. History often remembers the numbers: thousands killed, divisions shattered, artillery shells expended. But behind every statistic was a human face. A 19-year-old Marine from Ohio, a farmer-sipped son from rural Japan, both caught in a clash far larger than themselves. Private First Class Robert Leckie, a Marine on Guadalcanal, later recalled the terror of that moment. Suddenly they came in a rush, yelling and screaming, shooting as they ran. It was not soldiers we faced. It was a shrieking mass, a nightmare come to life. Marines like Leckie clung to their rifles in shaking hands, praying the artillery would answer in time. On the other side, Japanese infantryman Kiyoshi Kyoka, before being sent to Saipan, wrote in his diary, "We have been told that to die in battle is to serve the emperor forever. I am not afraid to die, but I think of my mother and my little sister. Will they remember me? Sib." Many Japanese soldiers never lived to see those words returned home. For the Japanese infantryman, the Banzai charge was not a choice, it was an order, rooted in culture, fear, and indoctrination. To refuse was death by your own officer, sword. To surrender was worse than death, and so thousands went forward, even knowing the outcome. American artillery crews felt the weight of this too. One Marine recalled a night on Saipan when a forward observer whispered coordinates into his radio. Seconds later, the howitzers roared. "I knew there were men down there," he wrote. "I could almost hear them screaming between the shells. But if we didn't fire, they'd overrun us. We had no choice." For the gunners, every shell was both survival and a killing blow against hundreds of human beings. This was the tragedy of the Pacific: men bound by honor, indoctrination, or orders, hurling themselves into storms of fire, and men on the other side, forced to unleash that storm to survive. But the scale of what was coming, the sheer desperation of Japan Sep's final great Banzai charges, would test both armies like never before, and it would leave behind fields of the dead so vast, even hardened Marines were shaken to their core. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had reached a turning point. The American island-hopping campaign was advancing relentlessly, carving through Japan's outer defenses. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Iniwetok, each island had fallen. And now, US forces set their sights on the Marianas, a chain of islands whose loss would bring Japan itself within range of American bombers. If Saipan fell, the US could launch B-29 raids directly against Tokyo. For Japan, this was unthinkable. Saipan was not just another island. It was a fortress, a shield for the home islands, defended by more than 30,000 troops. On June 15, 1944, the US Marines stormed ashore at Saipan. What awaited them was brutal. Fanatical resistance from caves, cliffs, and jungles. Every yard was contested with machine guns, snipers, and artillery hidden deep in the volcanic rock. But as days turned into weeks, the American war machine pressed forward. Tanks rolled inland, naval guns flattened ridges, and above all, American artillery crews, guided by forward observers with binoculars and radios, poured constant fire into Japanese defenses. The Japanese line began to crumble. And with it, their hope. For the Japanese commanders, defeat was inevitable. Supplies were gone. Ammunition dwindled. The once proud Imperial Army was reduced to starving remnants. Yet surrender was forbidden. To live while Saipan was lost would bring dishonor to family, emperor, and nation. So a decision was made. One last act of defiance. One final storm to sweep the invaders into the sea. The Banzai charge. This was not a raid or a probing attack. This was an army's death cry. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers prepared to hurl themselves in a single wave against the Americans. Officers, wounded men, even walking patients from field hospitals, all were ordered forward. It would be the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. American Marines sensed something was coming. The jungle grew eerily silent that night. Men tightened their grips on rifles, checked their grenades, and whispered final words to one another. Some wrote quick notes home, stuffing them in helmets or pockets. unsure if morning would come. When it did, all hell would break loose. July 7th, 1944. Saipan. In the dark hours before dawn, the jungle held its breath. The Marines of the 27th Infantry Division sat in shallow foxholes, exhausted, filthy, and half asleep. They had fought for weeks in brutal heat, pushing inch by inch across the island. Many believed the worst was behind them. They were wrong. From the shadows, thousands of Japanese soldiers assembled. Some carried rifles, others carried only bayonets or sharpened sticks. Wounded men limped forward, their bandages still soaked in blood. Doctors and stretcher-bearers walked beside them, clutching pistols or swords. This was not a military maneuver, it was a nation's death cry. Then, the roar. A tidal wave of voices shattered the night. Noted, Tenno Haika Banzai, long live the Emperor. 3,000 men surged from the darkness, charging headlong at the American lines. The ground shook beneath their boots. Bayonets glistened in the moonlight. It was chaos incarnate, a storm of human fury crashing against a wall of steel. American forward observers scrambled for their radios. Frantic voices barked coordinates into the night. Fire mission, grid 432. Within moments, the reply came, the Earth itself answered. Batteries of 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers unleashed a curtain of fire. The jungle lit up with searing flashes as shells rained down, tearing through the charging mass. Whole companies were obliterated in seconds, men hurled into the air, torn apart by shrapnel, but still they came. Over the bodies of their fallen comrades, the wave pushed forward. For hours, the battle raged hand to hand. Marines fired until barrels glowed red. Bayonets clashed in the dark. Men screamed, cursed, and fought with fists, knives, even shovels. One Marine later recalled, they were all around us, screaming, grabbing at us. We shot them point blank, but still they kept coming. By dawn, the American line was nearly broken. Whole companies were wiped out. The 27th Infantry Division lost nearly 650 men in a single night. For a moment it seemed the Japanese tide might succeed in swallowing the Marines whole. But the artillery never stopped. Again and again, coordinates were called in, and again the guns answered. By morning light, the battlefield was silent, except for the cries of the dying. More than 4,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead, the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War, reduced to ashes in one night. The charge had been brave, it had been desperate, but it had also been futile. Against the cold precision of American artillery, human courage alone could not prevail. And yet, this was not the end. For as the Americans dug in and tended their wounded, they knew the Pacific still held more nights like this. Japan was far from finished, and more waves of men were still waiting to charge headlong into death. Artillery had always been a weapon of war, but in the Pacific, against the fury of Banzai charges, it became something more, the great equalizer. By 1944, the United States had perfected a deadly system of coordination. At the heart of it were the forward observers, young lieutenants or sergeants who crept to the very edge of battle. They carried binoculars, maps, and most importantly, radios. Their job was simple in theory, but harrowing in practice to watch the battlefield, call out enemy positions, and guide the artillery's fire, shell by shell. A forward observer might whisper into his handset, "Hit a target at tree line 200 yards. Fire for effect." Within minutes, the skies erupted. Entire hillsides vanished in smoke and flame, and when the shells landed too far or too short, the observer adjusted with calm precision. Fell, 50. Left 100, fire again, fell. It was a deadly dance of mathematics and instinct, and in the chaos of a Banzai charge, it was often the difference between survival and annihilation. Behind the lines, the artillery crews worked with mechanical rhythm. Gunner Sip's mates heaved shells as heavy as 95 pounds into the breeches of 105 mm howitzers. Charges were set, breech blocks slammed shut, and the order rang out, "Thoa de fire." The guns roared in unison, shaking the earth. Barrel after barrel spat flame. In a single night, a battery could fire thousands of shells, an orchestra of destruction conducted by the forward observers at the front. For the Japanese charging into this storm, there was little chance of survival. Some tried to crawl between bursts. Others threw themselves flat, only to be torn apart by shrapnel seconds later. Yet the charges continued, not because they were tactically sound, but because honor demanded it. American artillery coordination turned these suicidal rushes into mass graves. But for the Americans, there was no triumph in this. Many Marines later admitted to nightmares. One gunner recalled, "Saipan, I knew we were saving ourselves, but when the firing stopped and the smoke cleared, I couldn't forget what we had done." Saipan. This was the turning point of the Pacific Ground War. The Japanese still had courage. They still had discipline, but courage alone could not stand against the combined might of radios, mathematics, and mechanized firepower. From Saipan to Guam to Leyte, the pattern would repeat. Japanese commanders hurled men forward in Banzai charges, and each time, American artillery tore them apart. The tide of war had shifted irrevocably. But while artillery coordination crushed Japan's tactics, the war was far from over. Each island became bloodier than the last, and the question loomed, if thousands would die in hopeless charges on Saipan, what would happen when American forces closed in on Japan itself? By the summer of 1944, the Americans had unlocked a formula. Saipan proved it. Artillery, when coordinated with discipline and precision, could annihilate massed Japanese assaults. And so, across the Pacific, the US military applied this strategy again and again, refining it into an art form. It began with observation posts. Forward observers, often perched on ridges or hidden in foxholes, mapped enemy movements with binoculars and radios. These men were the eyes of destruction, often just yards from the enemy. Their survival determined the survival of entire units. From their reports, fire direction centers translated coordinates into firing data. The calculations, angle, elevation, powder charge, were made in seconds, and then came the guns. Dozens of howitzers and long-range artillery fired not randomly, but in carefully orchestrated patterns, creeping barrages, box barrages, and kill zones that turned jungle paths into death traps. On Guam, this strategy crushed a massive Japanese counterattack in late July 1944. As thousands of infantry surged toward the American perimeter, forward observers called in overlapping barrages. Artillery rained down with such density that survivors described the battlefield as a sea of fire. When dawn broke, more than 3,200 Japanese soldiers lay dead, their charge obliterated before reaching the Marine line. On Leyte in October 1944, the Japanese tried again, hurling wave after wave into the teeth of US defenses. But by then the system was nearly flawless. Artillery fire was so responsive, so overwhelming, that entire battalions were destroyed before they could close within rifle range. The power of this coordination wasn't just in firepower, it was in speed. Observers reported, calculations were made, shells fired, and corrections issued within minutes. What had once taken hours in earlier wars was now instantaneous. Radios, discipline, and sheer logistical muscle turned the American Artillery Corps into a weapon of terrifying efficiency. But efficiency came with a human cost. For the Marines and GIs in the field, survival depended on unleashing a storm that left few enemies alive. For the Japanese soldiers trapped in a code that demanded death over surrender, there was no path but forward into the fire. And so the pattern repeated, island after island, charge after charge. Courage collided with coordination, honor met mathematics, and in the clash, tens of thousands died in moments. But the deadliest test still lay ahead. If American artillery coordination could shatter Banzai charges on Saipan, Guam, and Leyte, what would happen on Okinawa, the gateway to Japan itself? April 1945. The island of Okinawa, just 340 miles from Japan's home islands. For both sides, this was the final proving ground. To the Americans, Okinawa was the key to staging the invasion of Japan. To the Japanese, it was the last line of defense before their homeland. What followed would become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers prepared to defend the island. They knew they could not win, but they intended to make the cost unbearable. At night, Japanese units launched Banzai charges against American lines, hoping to break through with sheer willpower. One such attack in May 1945 began like so many others, screams of Banzai erupting through the night as hundreds of men rushed forward. But the Americans were ready. Within minutes, artillery batteries lit the darkness with fire. Forward observers calmly adjusted. Shift left 200 fire for effect. The jungle ahead exploded. By dawn, the charge had been erased. Yet Okinawa was more than charges. It was a grinding war of attrition. American artillery pounded Japanese cave defenses for weeks on end. Over 1.9 million shells fired across the battle. Entire ridges were leveled. Hills vanished beneath ceaseless bombardment. For the Japanese, this was annihilation. For the Americans, it was survival, but survival at a terrible price. Marines advanced over landscapes littered with the bodies of charging soldiers, many cut down before they ever reached the line. One Marine later wrote of Okinawa, "City, we fought men who were already dead, though they did not yet know it. They came at us with everything they had, and our guns cut them down by the thousands. It was victory, but it felt like murder." In the end, more than 7,000 Americans were killed, and 32,000 wounded. For Japan, the losses were catastrophic, over 100,000 soldiers dead, many in suicidal charges or hopeless last stands. The reversal was complete. What Japan had once used to terrify its enemies, the Banzai charge, had become a death sentence. Against American artillery coordination, there was no victory, only sacrifice. Okinawa proved the final truth of the Pacific War. Honor and courage alone could not stop the relentless machinery of American firepower. The Banzai charge, once the ultimate symbol of Japanese spirit, had become the ultimate symbol of futility. And yet, even in defeat, the Japanese resolve remained unbroken. The question now haunted American commanders: if Okinawa cost so much, what would an invasion of Japan itself look like? When the guns finally fell silent on Okinawa in June 1945, the island was no longer a battlefield, it was a graveyard. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Some had died in trenches, others in caves, and countless more in desperate charges against walls of steel and fire. Entire units had been erased, their names remembered only in casualty reports. The Americans had won, but at staggering cost. Over 12,000 Americans were killed, more than in any other Pacific battle. Another 50,000 were wounded. For the Marines and soldiers who survived, Okinawa was not remembered as victory. It was remembered as horror. Letters from the survivors capture this unease. One Marine wrote to his wife, "Do I am alive, but I don't so feel it. I see their faces at night, wave after wave, running at us. We cut them down, but they kept coming. God help me, I wonder if I shall ever sleep again." Do. For many, the relentless artillery barrages left a haunting memory. The ground itself seemed to come alive, trembling with constant explosions. The smell of cordite, the thunder of shells, these became the rhythm of survival. And yet, for all the destruction, the Japanese resolve had not broken. Even as the island fell, soldiers refused surrender. Many civilians, swept up in propaganda, chose death over capture. Okinawa had shown that no matter the odds, Japan would fight to the last. The greatest tragedy of Okinawa was not only military, it was civilian. At least 100,000 Okinawan men, women and children perished in the crossfire. Some were killed by shellfire, others coerced into suicide by a government that told them Americans would slaughter them. One Okinawan schoolteacher, who survived with only a handful of her students, later recalled, "Theta, the ground shook for months. We hid in caves, clutching children, as the world exploded above us. When we finally emerged, Okinawa was gone." It was in Okinawa SIP's ashes that American leaders faced a grim truth. If invading a single island cost over 200,000 lives, then invading Japan itself could mean millions. The Banzai charge, once a weapon of terror, had become a mass grave. America's artillery, combined with tanks, aircraft, and overwhelming fire coordination, had ended it forever. But the price of that end was unbearable. Okinawa was not just a battle, it was a warning. The world had seen what happened when spirit met steel, when courage met firepower. And the question still lingered in every Commander Sap's mind. If Japan would rather die than surrender, what would it take to end the war? The Pacific War was filled with extremes of courage and tragedy. The Japanese Banzai charge embodied the warrior spirit of a nation willing to sacrifice everything, but it also revealed the futility of throwing flesh and blood against the machinery of modern war. At Saipan, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, waves of men hurled themselves into storms of steel. They died by the thousands. And in their sacrifice, they proved a terrible truth that honor and bravery cannot overcome artillery, coordination, and industrial might. America's mastery of artillery was not just technical, it was psychological. Each strike was precise, calculated, and devastating. To the Japanese soldier, it felt as though the sky itself had turned against them. To the Americans, it was a shield, a lifeline in battles where survival was measured in minutes. But behind the statistics, behind the tactics, were men. Fathers, sons, brothers who faced each other in the darkness. One rushing forward with a bayonet and a cry, the other waiting in a trench, calling coordinates, pulling a trigger, surviving another night. They were enemies, but also victims, trapped in a war that demanded everything and offered nothing in return. The legacy of the Banzai charge is not one of glory, it is a warning. A reminder that courage without hope becomes tragedy, that war in its fury consumes even the bravest, and that sometimes the greatest act of heroism is simply to survive. Today, the fields of Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa are silent. But if you listen closely, you can still hear echoes of those nights when men charged into fire and artillery answered with thunder. May we remember their courage, but also their suffering. May we honor their sacrifice by ensuring that such storms of steel never return. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more echoes of history, because these voices, these lessons, must never be forgotten.